My name is Emma Lurie, and today I have the privilege of introducing Professor Dan Sichel. Professor Sichel is currently a professor of economics here at Wellesley. He came to Wellesley from the Federal Reserve Board, where he was the Senior Associate Director of the Division of Research and Statistics. Professor Sichel earned his bachelor's in economics and master's of public policy from the University of Michigan. He then went on to get his PhD in economics from Princeton University. In addition to a long tenure at the Fed, Professor Sichel has also held various research positions at the Brookings Institution, the U.S. Treasury Department, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Professor Sichel is currently a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, an advisory committee member at the Bureau of Economic Analysis, an executive committee member for the Conference on Research and Income and Wealth, and an international advisory board member at the International Productivity Monitor, a member of the American Economic Association, and according to an NPR report, a passionate Lady Gaga fan. Professor Sichel's research concerns macroeconomics, productivity, economic growth, economic measurement, and our favorite buzzword, technology. When hearing that Professor Sichel was coming to speak with us, Professor Joyce informed us that we were in for a real treat. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Sichel.
Thank you, Emma. So yeah, over the years I've collected a few, associations with this group or that group, but the Lady Gaga piece is the most important one, far and away the most important one. So I'm delighted to be here this morning. From looking over the program, a terrific lineup of speakers that you've had. We'll have the rest of this week, and then of course a real treat next week when you get to kind of the final week of things. So I'm really pleased to have been invited, really pleased to have a chance to participate in this. So I want to talk today about technological disruption in the future of work. I'm going to try to talk for about 45 minutes or so to be sure to leave some time for questions and discussion. I think we'll get some good topics for discussion and questions. I encourage you as I'm talking to think about either points where you would like to know more or potential points of disagreement, because that's a natural starting point for discussion. I'd say if there's a quick clarifying question, go ahead and ask during the presentation, but otherwise let's save the broader, bigger topic questions for the end. So I'm going to talk about technological disruption and the future of work. And I want to get into this by really noting that I think there's a very powerful narrative that's taken hold in the last few years, both in the popular media as well as in academic circles and in government circles, really focusing on this idea of robots and artificial intelligence are going to take all our jobs, that we're all going to become obsolete and that there'll be no more work because robots and machines will be able to do it all. So this would, of course, have huge implications. It'd have huge implications for the economy. Huge implications for the distribution of income. Who gets the gains from what all these machines might produce? And also, of course, for just society and politics more generally. And just as an example of how these kinds of forces can be very important, I would argue that fear related to job loss was one of the factors, or many factors, but one of the factors that likely contributed to President Trump's election a year ago. So, very important set of issues that I think is really kind of getting traction these days. And just to kind of highlight how this has gotten into the popular consciousness, here's an image from Jeopardy, the game show Jeopardy. I don't know if there are any Jeopardy fans in there. Okay, a couple Jeopardy fans in the audience. Okay, so game show. And what this is showing is a screen for the IBM supercomputer called Watson. And this is from a few years ago when Watson entered Jeopardy. And turned out that Watson, artificial intelligence, IBM supercomputer beat some of the all-time Jeopardy champs. So just an illustration that artificial intelligence has gotten to a point where a machine can play Jeopardy better than people can play Jeopardy. And I think that was one kind of milestone event that brought into kind of popular consciousness this idea of artificial intelligence really kind of moving forward. Since we're talking about work, here's a very iconic photo of work. Of course, this is from an earlier time, decades ago, when this kind of work, steel workers, building skyscrapers in a city, it was all men. But nonetheless, a very iconic photo of steel workers over New York City having lunch, sitting on a steel beam high above the city. Okay, so that's a picture that I think many people will have seen. So Mother Jones did a piece at the end of last year on the future of work and technology and how might all these factors play out. And so they did a graphic that was their updated version of this image. So here's their updated version of the image. And if you look, you'll see it really is, they're really trying to play off the original photo with the same configuration, even the same wire line running along the edge. But what you'll notice if you look carefully is that many of these characters are robots rather than people. So Mother Jones's idea of how robots are going to take over work. So again, just an example of how I think this is really pressed into kind of the popular consciousness about what's happening in the economy, what's happening to technology. So how dramatic could it be? What could actually happen in terms of how many jobs might be taken over or automated by machines and robots? Well, I think probably the most careful study that's been done on this was by Fry and Osborne, who are two academics from Oxford University in the UK. And they estimated, we'll talk more about what they did a little later, but they estimated that in the US, 47% of US jobs potentially could be automated in the next 10 to 20 years. Their estimate is a high-end estimate. There are other studies that would have lower numbers, but theirs is a very careful study with a kind of nice reproducible methodology. And the point I want to make now is just, this isn't just idle talk in the media and a Jeopardy episode, but there's serious academics who are saying this could be a really, really big deal. And just think about all the things that are happening. Robotics, artificial intelligence or AI, self-driving cars. There's the self-driving Uber vehicle, 3D manufacturing, where the whole nature and style of manufacturing could change completely. On artificial intelligence, think about Siri, Amazon Echo, even think about Roomba, right? There's a robot that now can do an everyday household chore. So just in kind of every dimension of life, robots, artificial intelligence moving in, and at least a couple academics who say this could be a really, really big deal. So here's what I want to do today. I want to talk through the key elements of this narrative, because the narrative has kind of a set of steps, and you have to kind of follow the logical sequence of steps. What do we know about each of these steps? And as we think about that, I want to put it in a bit of a historical context, because technological change and disruption is not new. It's been a feature of advanced market economies for a long time all around the world. And then I want to come around to, given these changes, given this narrative, what choices will policymakers face? And I think that's a natural place to kind of end. And I think is a really important set of questions for all of you, because it's really your cohort that's going to go forward into this world and ultimately are going to have to make decisions about how to respond to these changes and what should governments do, what should policymakers do in response to these kinds of changes. So that's where we're going to go today. So just to give you context, let me kind of give you a preview of my take on the issues, and maybe that'll help you to kind of situate things that I say and arguments that I make along the way. So my big picture take is that the dire forecasts of mass unemployment are overblown. But I think there are dramatic changes in the types of jobs people are going to have that are coming. And I'm going to make the case that policymakers shouldn't stand in the way of this change, but rather they should embrace the change, facilitate adaptation, and perhaps most importantly, ensure that losers are protected. And that's something that in the US, particularly to some extent in other advanced economies, but especially in the US, really hasn't been done so much in the last 30 years. And I think that's part of why we've had the political strife around these issues that we've had, because really the losers haven't been protected. But going forward, this would be my idea of how policymakers should respond. And if that's done, I think there's the potential to harness these technologies to achieve significant increases in living standards all around the world. Okay, so that's kind of my take. Now let's go through the elements of this narrative one by one. So here are the key elements of the narrative. Rapid technological change is going to displace many workers. As people lose jobs, that will lead to mass unemployment. And because you need a lot of skills and education to run all these machines, and you need to have a lot of resources to buy the machines, it's going to lead to further increases in income inequality. And the winners will get even richer, and everybody else will just be left behind. So that's the narrative that I think is fueling the unease that so many people, really all around the world, are feeling, and I think are fueling a lot of political movements around the world today. So let's look at each piece of this. Technological change. So there's an interesting question of how would you measure the pace of technological change? It's not such an easy thing to measure. Macroeconomists, my background, would start with a couple very basic measures, which are not the be-all and end-all of measuring technological change, but they're nice starting points. One would be to look at growth in labor productivity, which would be measured as something like output per worker or output per hour. So think of output as GDP, the total value of goods and services produced in an economy over the course of a year, divide by the number of people working. That tells you how much did each person produce on average. You know, what's the value of goods and services that each person produced? And that's an interesting way of thinking about technological progress, because if you compare today to 100 years ago, why are our standards of living, why are incomes and output so much higher now than 100 years ago? Well, importantly, that's because technology has gotten much better, and the tools that we have to use those technologies have gotten better. And so increases in labor productivity, they capture a lot of different factors, but among other things, will capture what's happening with technology. There's another measure economists use called multi-factor productivity growth. If you want to think of labor productivity as our output per unit of labor input, we could think of multi-factor productivity growth as output per unit of all inputs combined. So it's a little bit more of a complicated measure, but another way of trying to get at this idea of how much has technology improved, in the sense of how much more can a given amount of labor and capital and other inputs produce in the course of a year. So what do these numbers look like? So here's a chart starting in the mid-1970s showing average annual growth in labor productivity, blue bars, multi-factor productivity, red bars, kind of modest rates of growth from the mid-70s to the mid-90s, a boom from mid-90s to the mid-2000s. This is usually associated with the internet and personal computers and the spread of those technologies. And then since then, a step down. Last 5-6 years, these measures have actually grown really slowly. Here's a longer historical perspective. This is labor productivity growth, average annual rates going back into the 19th century. And again, I think the message you take from this is that in the recent decade, labor productivity has actually been slow by historical standards. So these measures actually indicate that technology growth has been quite slow. So that would undercut the first element of the narrative. Now that doesn't feel right to a lot of people. Why is that? Well, people look out into the world and see all the kinds of new technologies that I've just briefly alluded to, as well as a host of others in other fields. And this kind of casual empiricism, along with analysis by many commentators, myself included, have actually suggested that technical change is very rapid right now, but that those very aggregate, broad measures of productivity aren't reflecting that now. And the reason why is because it takes time for new technologies to diffuse through the economy to an extent that they will boost aggregate labor productivity or multi-factor productivity, those broad measures. And there's historical precedence for that, in that if we look back at the advent of steam power or the advent of electricity, a lot of evidence that it took decades from the time those technologies first appeared until they really transformed the macroeconomy. So the argument would be, we are in a period of rapid technical change, even though it's not showing up in those broad measures. We just have to be patient. Well, there's a very active debate underway amongst economists about what's going to happen to technical change going forward into the future. There are some who actually argue that it's going to remain very slow, that all the cool stuff's already been invented, and there's really not that much new cool stuff to invent. And there, the fear and the anxiety would not be technology displacing work. The fear and anxiety would be not enough technological progress. On the other hand are those who make the case that there's actually a lot happening. It's just that the conventional measures used by economists aren't yet reflecting it. So the debate matters a lot, one for the question about job displacement, kind of the focus for today. It also matters for living standards, because historically, countries that have seen big advances in technology, big increases in labor productivity, are countries that have seen big increases in living standards. And the simple logic of that is that countries where a given worker can produce a lot are on average countries where a given consumer can consume a lot. So we don't want to be too quick to say, well, let's just dismiss technological change because it might displace jobs. That might be true. But at the same time, technological change is the fuel or the seed corn that potentially enables further big increases in living standards. So for today, let's assume that technical change really is rapid and that artificial intelligence, machine learning, big data, all of the changes in the biomedical field, that these things really are undergoing dramatic transformations. And let's assume that for today. Let's think through the implications. But just keep in the back of your minds that there is a debate about just how rapid is technological change and how should we best measure it. So, second element in the narrative, after we talk about pace of technological change, is that will rapid technological change lead to job displacement? And here I think the answer is yes. So partly based on the Fry and Osborne analysis, also other studies, let's dig just a little bit more. Let me tell you just a little bit more about what they did to come up with that very dramatic 47% number. So what they did is they looked at an exhaustive list of occupations. They focused on the US, could have done some other country, but they focused on the US. So they looked at 702 occupations. And this classification of occupations, importantly, had descriptions of what are the skills needed for somebody engaging in this occupation and what are key characteristics of the occupation. And then they consulted a whole set of experts on machine learning and other technologies, used some judgment, used some statistical techniques to then assess how likely is it that each of those occupations might be automated. And they, of course, had a range because it's all probabilistic. And they had occupations that were in the range of likely to be automated and occupations that were in the range of not likely to be automated. And what they did is they picked off the occupations that they said were at high risk of being automated, meaning greater than a 70% chance of being automated. They added all those up and they got to 47% of jobs in the US. So it's a careful study. There are many places one could quibble with it. There are many ways one could do the analysis differently and get a different number. But nonetheless, they did a careful analysis and highlight that there are a lot of jobs that have the potential to be automated given what's happening with many of these new technologies. So let's just look a little bit more at the job mix and what might some of these changes be. So David Autor, who's an economist at MIT, developed this jobs matrix, which divided jobs into those that are primarily manual, meaning moving objects or manipulating objects, and those that are cognitive, which is to say moving or manipulating ideas, and then dividing further into jobs where the tasks are mostly routine and jobs where the tasks are mostly non-routine. So let's just think about where are we on this kind of automation scale within each cell of this matrix. So if we start with routine tasks, these actually have largely been automated to a very significant degree. If you think about manual tasks, just think about all the automation in manufacturing that's happened over the last 100 years, 50 years, even 20 years. So much automation that many, many fewer people work in manufacturing now than did many years ago because we just don't need as many people to operate factories to produce stuff. On the cognitive side, there's actually also been a lot of automation. So listed a few here. Airline reservations, now it's almost all airline reservations get made online automatically. A lot of office work that used to be done by a worker sitting at a desk, automated. Filing, who files anymore? It's all electronic records. Who even submits receipts anymore? It's all electronic records. Cash machines, online banking, checkout clerks, barcode stores, experimenting with the idea of you just put stuff in a cart, and when you walk out, you have a reader that reads everything in the cart and tells you what you have and automatically bills your credit card. So lots of automation there. Non-routine tasks are harder, and here some of these have happened. Some of this is more about potential. So think about industrial robots. So think about Amazon. Think about an Amazon warehouse that importantly uses robots to pick products off shelves and gather them for an order that somebody's put together. Think about household robots. Think about driverless vehicles. So what's interesting is that 10, 15 years ago, people would have said that these non-routine tasks can't be automated. They're just too hard. So there's actually David Autor, the guy who did this matrix back in 2003, said driverless car, it's just way too hard. You know, imagine on a busy road trying to make a left turn and programming a car to be able to do that in a safe way. It's just too hard a problem. Can't get a computer to do it. Well, now we're on the cusp of driverless vehicles becoming a reality because the AI has gotten good enough to make that quite feasible. Finally, if we think about cognitive non-routine tasks, also things that once upon a time people would have said never could be automated, well, now are getting automated to some extent. Some interesting things with healthcare diagnostics, legal and financial services. You can now get investment advice from AI system. Condition sensing, so for example, monitoring security cameras, Apple, Siri, Amazon Echo, all these kinds of things. Even in education where you might think, well, you know, teacher, students, what's changing there? But, you know, there are things like cognitive tutors. So for instance, for algebra, there are now cognitive tutors that are specifically designed for an individual student so that the cognitive tutor can figure out exactly what that student doesn't understand about algebra and then can tailor instruction that focuses on exactly what that student needs. And randomized controlled trials have shown that those kinds of cognitive tutors significantly enhance learning outcomes. Now that's not really replacing teachers, it's maybe more complementing teachers, but just a whole set of cognitive non-routine tasks that artificial intelligence is on the verge of automating. So a lot of things that could be automated if we think about kind of this Fry and Osborne analysis. Harder things to automate, soft skills, things related to perception, creativity, social intelligence skills, much harder to automate. These are the kinds of things that would be in their low probability of being automated tasks. So what about history? As I said, technological change is not a new feature. It's something that has been prevalent really for the last 250 years. So there's been a lot of job displacement. So in the US, let's think about agriculture. In 1850, 50% of workers in the US worked in agriculture. Today, less than 5%. That is pretty massive job displacement. Manufacturing, 1950, a little over 30% of US workers worked in manufacturing. Today, 8.5%. Massive job displacement. So, has technology displaced jobs in the past? Absolutely. Absolutely it has. Why are so many fewer people working on farms? Because a farm worker can produce so much more food now that you don't need thousands of people producing food. A small number of people can produce all the food needed in the US as well as exporting a lot of food. So technology, disruption, job displacement, not new. And just for fun, I would just note that fear or concern about jobs is not new either. So there's a kind of famous quote by Thomas Mortimer, who was an English writer in the 18th century, who said, wished he'd never see saw and stamp mills. These were automated mills of one sort or another because they'd exclude the labor of thousands of the human race who are usefully employed. And maybe most famously, although perhaps also quite misunderstood, the Luddites and their resistance against automated mills in the early 19th century in England and being concerned about impoverishment from new technologies. And we could go through later in the 19th century, 20th century and find many other examples of fear and concern about technology. So a lot of job displacement. But despite that job displacement, overall employment in the US and around the world, as well as GDP, or output, what's the value of goods and services produced per person, increased dramatically. So just to pick off the period since 1950, employment in the US, up by more than 3 times. GDP per person in the US, up by more than 3 times, about 3.5 times. So we've had all this job displacement, but we've also had a big increase in employment and in GDP per person. So how do we reconcile those things? Well, the job displacement is an incomplete description of the effects of technology, because in the past, technological change also created new jobs. How does it do that? Well, it lowers prices of some products, which frees up income that could be used for other things. It creates income for the people who create these new technologies, and that higher income increases demand for existing products and increases demand for new products, and it takes people to produce those new products. So in the past, new technologies actually have overall expanded employment, expanded the economy, at the same time that they've been displacing jobs. And it's also the case that technology has enhanced existing jobs. And technology isn't necessarily just a substitute for jobs, it may be a complement to jobs. So in that example of cognitive tutors for algebra, I don't think that's something that's going to replace algebra teachers, but might allow algebra teachers to leverage their instruction in a way that would enhance learning outcomes for students. So here's a chart that kind of shows the whole picture. This I pulled from a McKinsey study. It shows shares of employment in the US by sector since 1850. And this light blue region is the share of agricultural employment. So you can see the big shrink in agricultural employment. Dark blue area is manufacturing. You can see the increase in the share of manufacturing through 1950, 1970 or so, and then the shrinkage since then. So job displacement there, but then all of these areas, which are service-oriented sectors of the economy, education, financial services, entertainment, healthcare, communications, employment in those areas has increased quite dramatically, as has employment in this top area, which is what gets labeled trade. But think of that as everybody who's involved in not producing goods, but in getting goods from their point of production to consumers. So, stores, restaurants, retail trade, all of that. That's expanded quite significantly as well. So we've seen job displacement, but we've seen job expansion elsewhere, as shows through in this graphic. So will technological change lead to mass unemployment? The historical record certainly says no. Could this time be different? Maybe. These technologies are different than past technologies. To me, it doesn't seem particularly likely. I think we're more likely to see a set of new jobs and expansion of existing jobs. I just listed a few that kind of quickly came to mind. There are many others that we could think of, and probably many others that we can't think of, because we haven't gotten there yet. But healthcare, especially with an aging population, technology, things related to soft skills, education. If we're going to be in a world where technology and education are more important, maybe we actually need more people involved in education rather than fewer. Think about all of the likely changes in energy efficiency, climate change. Those are all going to take people to do those things. So I think there's great potential for new employment in new types of jobs. So I would discount or say the fears of mass unemployment are overblown. I think they're focusing on the negative side of the ledger and not the positive side of the ledger. But what about the distribution of income? That I think is a tougher question, or a question where the answer is it's a less happy answer. The historical record, I think, is mixed. In most periods before the 1980s, technological change generated broad gains in earnings, although even in periods where, where things were generally getting better, there were winners and the losers weren't necessarily very well protected, particularly in the US. Since the 1970s, though, incomes have risen much faster in the US for higher income groups. There are many causes of that, and it's an active area of debate amongst economists. But I think automation is one important factor. The kind of logic of that story being that automation is going to benefit people with education and skills, and so they find that the automation, the new technologies enhance their abilities to produce, their abilities to earn income, and it leaves behind people without the education and skills. And so we see automation likely being one factor contributing to this worsening distribution of the income. And just to put a few numbers on it, here's a chart from the Congressional Budget Office. It's showing since 1979 what has been the cumulative growth in household income by income group. So looking at the top 1% of households and then looking at different groups of households. And what we see is that for the top 1% of households, since 1979 through 2013, which is the last year they could do, 186% increase in household income. That's adjusted for inflation, so that's an increase in purchasing power. Other quintiles, other income groups didn't do so well. 81st to 99th percentile, decent, 65% cumulative increase in purchasing power. But then you look at the middle income groups or lower income groups, 27, 28% increase over that period. So many of the gains from economic growth back since about 1980 have accrued to the top 1%. And arguably, automation is one of the factors contributing that. A lot of other things we could talk about, the decline of unionization. We could talk about the politics in the US and the greater influence of those with higher incomes. We could talk about Citizens United and how that's increased the influence of money in politics. Host of things we could talk about. Automation, I think, though, would be importantly on the list. Okay, so bottom line, thinking through this narrative and the elements of the narrative, rapid technological change likely will lead to job displacement. There are plenty of people who are going to lose jobs because of technological change or see their jobs change dramatically. It also creates new jobs, and I think is unlikely to lead to mass unemployment. That being said, the types of jobs people have will change very significantly. Big changes coming. Jobs are likely going to require more skill, and unless there are policy interventions, could very well worsen the income distribution. And the inequality of income is already a huge problem in the US. This could make it worse. So let's think about policy choices. So if this is the world we face, and you may quibble, you may argue with me as to whether that's the world we face, but if it is, then policymakers are going to face some choices. On the one hand, technological change creates opportunity for higher living standards, so it's something that can be harnessed and leveraged. On the other hand, it can lead to job displacement and worsening of the income distribution. But just to think on the positive, let's imagine a Star Trek world. Any Star Trek fans? Okay. Yeah, all right. So I was not a huge Star Trek fan. My older brother was an unbelievable Trekkie, and so I saw all the stuff growing up because he was just a total Trekkie. But imagine a Star Trek world. Well, that's a world without scarcity. Nobody on Star Trek works for income. They work because they want to find meaningful work, because they have replicators that can make anything anybody wants. There's no more scarcity in that world. So that would actually be a pretty nice world to live in, I think. But that would be a world where artificial intelligence, machines, robots had displaced most of the work people do today. Doesn't displace captains of starships, but it displaces a whole lot of other jobs. That could actually, though, be a great world, provided that social and political structures changed and adapted to that new world. Because there's a very nice, good outcome. There's also a potentially bad outcome. So let's think about policy choices. Let's consider two scenarios. The one that I'm suggesting is the most likely, which is, dramatic changes in the type of work, but not really an end of work. People are still working for income. We're not quite in the Star Trek world. Work still matters. Jobs have changed, but people are still working. And we can also consider the Star Trek version, or really the end of work scenario. So I want to think through those two scenarios and what kinds of choices might policymakers face in each of those scenarios. Well, there are three broad policy responses. Here's kind of a very broad brushstroke characterization of policy responses. One would be to do nothing. Another would be to slow down or disrupt the technological change. Say our society can't absorb it. It's causing displacement of workers. It's just causing too much turmoil. Don't want it to happen. Let's find ways to slow down and disrupt it. Or, which would be my preferred outcome, could embrace change and do a better job, a much better job than has been done about protecting those who are hurt and trying to facilitate transitions from old jobs to new jobs. So there's kind of three broad ways that policymakers could respond. So I like matrices. So I did a matrix. Here are the two different scenarios, the change in job type scenario, the end of work scenario. And here are some policy options: slow down, disrupt, embrace. And in a minute, we'll tuck in the do nothing option as well. So let's think about what sorts of policies might fall into each of these elements of the matrix. So in the scenario, changes in job types, the slow down and disrupt. So what might we do if we wanted to slow down and disrupt this technological change? Could put a tax on robots. Actually, Bill Gates suggested that, which is kind of funny, but he did. So could, tax robots and AI. Could cut research spending, since after all, federally funded research is one of the ingredients that fuels technological change. So you cut back on research. You cut back on education, because of course education, higher education in particular, is one of the ingredients that fuels technical advance and that kind of progress. Could put tariffs on imports, because maybe if we try to slow this down in the US, but other countries make a different choice and so they're pushing ahead, then we'd want to keep out the stuff that they can make that's better and less expensive, because that would be disruptive. So it could put tariffs on imports. And we also could block immigration of educated and skilled people, because that's another area that fuels technological progress and advance. So and again, this is just a sample. There are many, many policies that I'm sure you could think of that would fit into that cell, but there are a few. On the other hand, if we wanted to embrace technical change and protect losers, so we could try to reimagine job training programs designed in the, 1950s, 60s, 70s. I think we could do better. Could do much more to provide income and transition support to those hurt by new technologies. Could do more progressive taxation. Could do wealth taxes as ways of dealing with unequal distribution of income. Could reform and refocus education to try to, if we're in a world where education and skill is going to matter more, to find ways to provide more access and opportunity for a wider range of people, and also could support education and research. So that's another policy agenda. If one says, hey, this is a good thing, let's figure out how best to use it. End of work scenario, if we get there, it's too late to slow down and disrupt. We're already there. There's no more work. There's nothing left to slow down or disrupt. And if we get to the end of work scenario and we're in the let's embrace and protect, what might that look like? This is like the Star Trek world. Well, we have to separate or split work from income, because people don't need to work for money anymore. That probably means very progressive taxation, combined perhaps with what's called universal basic income, or UBI. That's the idea of the government, say, just gives everybody $70,000 a year, and then you do what you want. And that's actually an idea. It might sound a little radical, but it's actually an idea that's getting some traction. Libertarians like it, and many on the Many progressives like it too. So it's kind of getting some interesting traction, known as UBI, and there's some interesting experiments going on about universal basic income in several countries. Another possibility would be the socialization of robots and AI. Just have the government run it all. And then they could give out the benefits to people. So there are a variety of different models and ways that one could approach this. We could talk about which might be preferred, but a whole variety of different ways that that one could think about, how might we reorganize the economy, society, policy in that world. So, different policy choices are going to lead to different outcomes. And there's obviously tremendous uncertainty about the effects of technological change, tremendous uncertainty about the effects different policy choices will have. Just think about the debate recently about the effects of the tax cuts that were passed about a month ago, and the wide range of views about what effects those might have on the economy and different groups of people. Okay, well now, I don't know, multiply by 10 or 100 because we're trying to look 10 or 20 or 30 years ahead to very broad policy. So plenty of uncertainty. That being said, let's speculate about possible outcomes. So now let's think about what might outcomes be if the policies in each of these different cells were followed for each of our different scenarios, and in a do-nothing approach, a slow-down, disrupt approach, and an embrace and protect policy response to these changes. So I would argue that in the changes in job types, the do-nothing, probably continue with kind of modest socioeconomic growth. Almost surely would have a worsening income distribution, and I think would have significant political turmoil as a result of that, and kind of continued political strife and polarization and partisanship. In the slowdown disrupt scenario, I think we'd see slower increases in living standards. I put the president's picture there because if you think back to those policies, I would say that's, broad brushstrokes, but I would say that's kind of where he's put himself. There's a bunch of stuff happening that's making people insecure. We need to protect people from that. We need to stop these things from happening. We need to keep immigrants out, not particularly interested in research and education. And if we think about the other policy pieces there, that's kind of where he's put himself. On the embrace and protect side, I think we'd see more rapid increases in living standards, and I think there'd be the potential to limit worsening of the income distribution if those sorts of policies were pursued. With the end of work, if nothing were done, I think we'd have an exceptionally unequal income distribution. There'd be a small group of people who would own and control all of these technologies, and they would basically get all the benefits, and everybody else would be left out. I think that would be a scenario for extreme political turmoil and disruption in the US and in other countries. Too late to slow down and disrupt. And if policies were pursued in a smart way and we got to that kind of Star Trek scenario, maybe not in 10 or 20 years, but maybe in 40 or 50 years, we could be in a world where there was no more scarcity. I don't know what economists would do if there was no more scarcity. But I think it could be, it has the potential to be a really good, really exciting world. So, all right, to kind of draw this to a close, what should be done? Well, best policy choices depend on, one, preferences over different outcomes, and also the perceived probability of different outcomes, because again, there's a lot of uncertainty around all of this. But there are choices that, again, your cohort is going to have to make about how to respond to these kinds of changes that are coming. So again, just to kind of come back to how I would assess these issues, I don't think we're yet close to the end of work. Maybe by the end of your lives, maybe we'll be in that Star Trek world. I don't think I'll be on the scene anymore. I think it's going to take a while to get there. I do think there are dramatic changes coming, though, and disruptions to types of work that people do. And then there's some policy choices about how to respond, whether to try to slow that down or try to harness and embrace it. But in order to harness and embrace it and to make the politics of that work, it is essential that a much greater effort is made to protect vulnerable citizens, because there will be losers from changes in changes in technology. And I get to that partly because I think the alternatives are not very pretty. So let me stop there. I'd be very happy to answer questions. If you don't have questions, I have some questions for you, but I'm guessing you'll have some questions and things that you want to talk about. So let me stop there and let me open things up for questions, comments, reactions.